All right, First Corinthians. We'll pick up where we left off in 1 Corinthians 7. Hey, Athena. That's my dog. Well, she's really my neighbor's dog, but she's mine. Yes. All right, and where did we leave off? Verse 16 in 1 Corinthians 7. Paul is giving us good marital advice and instruction. And so we're going to pick it up here in verse 16. Actually, let's start off at 13 to continue his thought there. He says, "And a woman who has a husband who does not believe, if he is willing to live with her, let her not divorce him. For the unbelieving husband is sanctified by the wife, and the unbelieving wife is sanctified by her husband. Otherwise, your children would be unclean, but now they are holy." Verse 15. "But if the unbeliever departs, let him depart. A brother or sister is not under bondage in such cases, but God has called us to peace." All right, verse 16 now. "For how do you know, O wife, whether you will save your husband? Or how do you know, O husband, whether you will save your wife?" Yeah, we simply don't know if our example of faithfulness in marriage to an unbeliever will lead them to salvation. We don't know that. We can only pray and do our best at being the best married spouse and Christian husband that or wife that we can be. But in the end, if they leave, they leave. We are responsible for our responsibilities, not theirs. We are commanded to do what we are supposed to do. All right, verse 17 says, "But as God has distributed to each one, as the Lord has called each one, so let him walk. And so I ordain in all the churches." I find it interesting here. As God has distributed to each one, he says. That word right there is most often translated as divided or separated apart to be shared. Like when Jesus was asked by someone in the crowd, "Hey, teacher, tell my brother to divide the inheritance with me." That's the same word that's used here. And it's only translated as divided twice, both times by Paul. When God has given a couple in marriage, they and the children born to them have been separated from others. They are a unit distributed together under the heading of a family unit. And it is the Lord who does this. That's what Paul meant when he said in verse 14 that this is how the children are not unclean but holy. The only other time this word is translated as distributed is in the next letter, second letter to the Church of Corinthians. In chapter 10, Paul said, "But we will not boast of things beyond measure, but within the limits of the sphere of God, which God has distributed to us," a sphere that includes you. Which in the New King James, it says the sphere which God has appointed to us. And so God has appointed to each of us, set us apart, divided us apart together as a family unit. And he says, as the Lord has called us. We were called to where we are at the moment. Whether married or single, that is the place we are to walk in. If God has saved us before we are married, and then we marry, we shall live accordingly as a married Christian believer. If he called us after we got married, we also walk now as his followers, as a Christian believer. The marriage, it's blessed by him. And we are to be faithful to the marriage we are in, whether the spouse is saved or not. This, he says, is to be the way in every church, not just a specific church there in Corinth. He says, but in all churches everywhere, including ours today. All right, next verse, 18. He says, was anyone called while circumcised? Let him not become uncircumcised. Was anyone called while uncircumcised? Let him not be circumcised. Circumcision is nothing, and uncircumcision is nothing, but keeping the commandments of God is what matters. Verse 20 says, let each one remain in the same calling in which he was called. Yes, the commandments, keeping the commandments of God is what matters. Paul now joins this topic with another topic, and they both can be thought of in like manner. And it's, if a Gentile, uncircumcised, gets saved, he is part of the church now. He doesn't have to get circumcised. Just like marriage, if we are married when we get saved, we stay married. If we are not married when we get saved, that is our focus at the time. And if the Lord so wills someone to get married, he will bring them together. But our focus is to be faithful in that place that he has us in. No matter if our spouse is saved or not, we don't go looking for a possible different spouse who is saved. I almost think this is what Paul was dealing with here. Remember in chapter 5, Paul addresses the man who was in a relationship with his stepmom. And then right after that in chapter 6, he talks about brothers in the church going to court, suing each other in civil court rather than dealing the matter within the church body. And then he goes to having sexual relations outside of marriage. And then he goes directly here to marriage and divorce issue. I almost think that maybe that's what he is still addressing here. Just my thought. What if he was calling the church into account that some were taking this matter to court to divorce an unbelieving spouse? I think that was probably happening. What if we actually today did settle our marriage struggles inside our church family, not getting a lawyer and pursuing towards and through the legal system? Just a thought. How many marriages would be renewed versus how many would still get divorced? I think today, and this is not a judgment, just an observation, I've been through it, but how often when two professing Christians struggling in marriage, when they go through the civil court systems and they divorce, do they not like withdraw from the body, it would seem, during that process? Maybe the offended spouse, because they are hurt and ashamed, they hide and disappear like they're a failure. Or the offender, because they too cannot confront the path that they are choosing to or have chosen to walk in. And so they shy away from the church family, which is exactly what the adversary wants us to do. He wants the sheep isolated. And so they go to civil court to carry this out. It's sad. What if the offended spouse, living with an unbeliever, did what Paul instructs here? And yeah, sometimes the right thing is never easy. We are to walk in the place where God called us, where he divided us to, appointed us to, that sphere. Yeah, verse 21 says, were you called while a slave? Do not be concerned about it, but if you can be made free, rather use it. For he who is called in the Lord while a slave is the Lord's freed man. Likewise, he who is called while free is Christ's slave. You were bought at a price. Do not become slaves of men. Brethren, let each one remain with God in that state in which he was called. Yeah, don't be consumed with trying to get married or trying to gain your freedom if you are a slave. God will provide. Your main interest should be him and your faithful walk. As the Lord leads, he may open other doors to you to no longer be a servant, or slave, or no longer be single, but he is to be first and foremost in our lives. In wherever we are, whatever life situation we are in, he should consume our thoughts. And then he went on to say in verse 22 that he who is called a Lord while a slave is the Lord's freedman. We need to see ourselves as free in Christ, and that we were bought with a price, Christ's blood. We are his. We no longer are only concerned about our own wants and needs now. We truly are his, and he will gift and bless us in the place that we are. If he has marriage in his plan for us, he will bring it to pass. We don't have to search all day, every day, consuming our time and emotions. We must wait on him. And if we are a slave who seeks only to be free, we must see ourselves first as free in him, and trust the place he has us in now, and pray for where he would have us to go, whether we remain in that place or he opens a door elsewhere. Always remaining in him. All right, verse 24 says, "Brethren, let each one remain with God in that state in which he was called." Just as Paul gave instruction to the married, now he gives instructions to those who are not married, those who are single. So in verse 25 now, he says, "Now concerning virgins, I have no commandment from the Lord, yet I give judgment as one whom the Lord, in his mercy, has made trustworthy." Yeah. Verse 26, "I suppose, therefore, that this is good because of the present distress, that it is good for a man to remain as he is. Are you bound to a wife? Do not seek to be loosed. Are you loosed from a wife? Do not seek a wife." Yeah, again, he prefaces this with, this isn't a command in the scripture, in the Old Testament. He won't find it there, but being he is writing under the inspiration of the Holy Spirit here, we need to listen up. Paul says it was by God's mercy shown to him that his words here are trustworthy, and so we need to trust these words. Okay, well, Paul is saying if you are not married, life might be easier if you don't get married. He says, I'm just trying to spare you a little heartache. I almost hear him say, I suppose because of the current situations, like he says, it's probably a good idea to stay single because y'all got baggage. I'm just saying. Yeah, he's saying don't go shopping, swiping left or swiping right. Wait on the Lord. And then he says again, but in verse 28 or 18, he says, 28. Sorry, I got lost here. Verse 28 says, let me find my place. "But even if you do marry, you have not sinned. And if a virgin marries, she has not sinned. Nevertheless, such will have trouble in the flesh, but I want to spare you." Yeah, he's trying to spare us. Paul is so wise. Searching can bring relationships. Relationships can bring marriage. Marriage can bring baggage. Baggage can bring struggles. Struggles can bring disharmony. Disharmony can bring fights. And fights can open the door to, say like an understanding friend of the opposite sex who can sympathize with us, who knows exactly what we're going through. They understand me, unlike my wife. She doesn't understand me. No, not like this woman does. Who offers a shoulder to lean on. Besides me and my wife, we have nothing in common. But this gal, we got a lot in common. Blah, 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 blah. Paul is just warning us. He said we will have trouble in the flesh. And his whole thought is the Lord being first and foremost in our lives and in our marriages. It's not a sin to marry. It just carries a little more responsibilities and struggles and a little more time management. And he says, it's not a sin to marry. Verse 29 says, "But this I say, brethren, the time is short, so that from now on even those who have wives should be as though they had none, those who weep as though they did not weep, those who rejoice as though they did not rejoice, those who buy as though they did not possess, and those who use this world as not misusing it. For the form of this world is passing away." Yeah, we spend so much of our time, so much of our thought and energy seeking and dealing with love and relationships. And that Paul says here, look, the Lord's returning soon. Let's not lose sight of that. Let's keep that most important. And we know as the world closes in around us today, we know this all too well. Yeah. How should we be spending our time and efforts? Being single has its benefits in available time and resources to serve in these last days. But don't waste the time looking for what you want. Spend it in His service. And if God so chooses to bless with marriage, okay then, good. Because the married couple and family can also do so much in the Lord, blessing others and serving Him. All right, verse 32. "But I want you to be without care. He who is unmarried cares for the things of the Lord, how he may please the Lord. But he who is married cares about the things of the world, how he may please his wife." Yeah, the struggles that single women and married women, the struggles they have are different. Same with men. That's just how life is. And Paul is trying to spare everyone so that they are fully aware of what they're getting into. Yeah. Paul goes on to describe the virgin as an unmarried woman and how she and a married woman, how they have different priorities when walking with the Lord. Verse 34 says, "There is a difference between a wife and a virgin. The unmarried woman cares about the things of the Lord, that she may be holy, both in body and in spirit. But she who is married cares about the things of the world, how she may please her husband." Yeah. Verse 35, he goes on and says, "And this I say for your own profit, that not that I may put a leash on you, but for what is proper, that you may serve the Lord without distraction." Yeah, Paul says, look, I'm not trying to hold you back from anything, trying to leash you. He says, I don't enjoy saying these things, but trust me, I'm trying to spare you a lot of trouble. That first and foremost, you may serve God without all the other problems that can and will arise in marriage and the matters of life. Verse 36, he says, "But if any man thinks he is behaving improperly towards his virgin, if she is past the flower of youth, and thus it must be, let him do what he wishes. He does not sin. Let them marry." Yeah. Paul, like a loving father, now says, all right, if you two really love each other and you have both thought about these things really hard and prayed over it, and you still want to go this route, and you're even starting to want to consummate the marriage really, really soon, really, really bad, he says, well, okay then, by all means, go for it, get married. Verse 37, he says, "Nevertheless, he who stands steadfast in his heart, having no necessity," means they don't have to get married, "but has power over his own will, and has so determined in his heart that he will keep his virgin, does well." Yeah, he says on the other side, if you don't want to marry, you're perfectly happy serving God while single, don't let others pressure you into getting married. Don't let others pressure you into getting your daughter married. He says you are good. You don't have to. And he's speaking to a culture that was arranging marriages in those days. The parents doing so. Parents, you don't have to wed your daughter off. You don't have to, just because society around you says so. If your child feels called to serve the Lord without marriage, honor that calling. You haven't sinned, he's saying. If the child feels called to raise a godly family in the Lord, well then, give them away in marriage then. Verse 38, he goes on, so then he who gives her in marriage does well, but he who does not give her in marriage does better. Verse 39, a wife is bound by law as long as her husband lives, but if her husband dies, she is at liberty to be married to whom she wishes, only in the Lord. Yeah, single women are free to marry, but a woman who has a husband is to remain married to him. Married women don't go gallivanting around with single women. Doesn't end well. Same for married men. Don't hang out all the time with the single guys, and don't go bar hopping and stuff like that with them. And he says also, especially don't hang out with single women, you married guys. You're married. Don't ever hang out with a married woman. Single women, hang out with married women. Watch and learn, especially before you decide to marry. Same for guys. Glean off them. And then here he said, those who have lost a husband. He says, you're free to marry, just like the single woman, but only if he is a believer, he said. Remember back in the last chapter, Paul encouraged us to be equally yoked. And also in verse 39 here he says, the woman who lost her husband, she gets to choose whoever she wants to marry. Her family or the church doesn't decide, but she would be wise to counsel others and listen to their advice. Sometimes our desires and our puppy love attitudes can blind us to the glaring, flashing caution lights. And to those single people, sometimes in the back seat of a car, it's hard to not only see the caution flag, but I'd say you already blew right past that one. And now you don't stop to see the red flag, the stop sign, or worse, you see it and ignore it. Yeah, the decision we make about these things should be made before we even find ourselves inside the car. If you don't get in the car, you won't find yourself in the back seat. Where in the back seat, there's little willpower left, no matter how bright that red light's flashing at you. Yeah, the back seat is both literal, it's a literal place and a euphemism. Back seat, danger, Will Rogers, danger. Let's be more cautious and aware of where we place ourselves in life, in our daily happenings. Verse 40, he goes on, but she is happier, the widow, if she remains as she is, according to my judgment. And I think I also have the Spirit of God. Yeah, Paul thinks this to be true in his best opinion. And he thinks he is being inspired by the Lord in this. And of which I would say, yes, Paul, you are. And so, yes, the widow or the widower might be happier. But for some, they can and are free to be remarried in the Lord. So there, tough stuff. Good stuff, Paul. Yeah, let's take those things to heart. All right, next time, chapter 8, we will move onward.